I'll go into a little bit of detail here. Vladimir was dissatisfied with his old pagan religion, worshiped many gods, so he decided he'd change religions to become like everybody else. So he examined 4 religions: Judaism, Islam, Orthodox Catholicism, and Roman Catholicism. Well, he rejected Roman Catholicism because Roman Catholicism said you must be loyal to the Pope. And he said, I'm going to be in charge. I'm not going to be taking orders from the Pope. So he rejected Rome. Then he looked into Islam. Islam said you should not drink. Now, anybody who knows anything about Russians know Russians drink a lot. I mean, folks, that's just stating fact. I mean, it's simply weird. So he said, no, I can't accept Islam because also that Islam did not allow him to gamble either. And so he threw Islam out. Then he examined Judaism, but he said, well, any God who wasn't strong enough to keep his own people in their homeland was not strong enough for him. So then he looked into Orthodoxy, and he entered an Orthodox church. He said it was like going into another world. He said it was like I entered heaven. The Orthodox was stained glass windows with Bible scenes pictured on the stained glass, and the choir said it sounded like it was heaven itself. So he became Orthodox, and the Russians were Orthodox Christians from that time to this. And again, I want to reiterate what I said earlier. Everywhere the Orthodox have been in charge, if Islam hasn't taken over, the communists have. I mean, that's just stating a fact. And again, any of you can research as to why that is. I have my own opinions. I've spent some time studying it. But anyway, eventually the Mongolians conquered Russia under Genghis Khan. Moscow became the chief center of Russia, owing to this good fortune, folk, that Moscow had. Moscow went for 200 years, only 5 rulers. Every one of the 5 rulers lived to be old men. When they died, they turned the throne over to a mature middle-aged man, who in turn lived to be an old man. And then for 200 years, when I had 5 rulers, means that each one of them ruled an average of 40 years. You know, and only mature men were governing them. And during that time, the people of Russia began to look to leadership to Moscow instead of to Kiev. Now, in our Constitution, we have a clause, and the Constitution has never been changed, that our president must be at least 32 years old. Still in the books, folks. Now, I know I'm talking to a class where most of you are under 32. Hey, let me tell you something. No, the president must be 35, pardon me, 35. Senator's 32. Most of you are probably under 32. Let me tell you something, you'll get there soon enough. So don't worry about it. All of us were under 32 at one point. I always was myself. That's been a long time. Anyway, we have that in our Constitution. And again, part of it is because our founding fathers knew that young people who were too young to lead oftentimes led the country downhill. And there have been case after case of this. But Moscow had the good fortune of having good leaders for at least 200 years. High Middle Ages. The High Middle Ages were hot as a firecracker, folk. Really hot, and it was a time when vegetation was plush. Farmers could grow their crops easily. And more and more serfs could buy their freedom. Europeans began to move from farm to the town. Now, folks, this is important because the more city dwellers you have, the more likely you are to have things like airplanes or automobiles eventually develop. You have to get the people off the farm and into crafts like blacksmiths, tanners, weavers, cloth makers, cobblers. You have to have manufacturing. Between the years 1000 and 1300, Europe's population doubled. Conditions were peaceful. More produce, partly because of better farming techniques. Iron, I mentioned a lot of things that iron was used for. The Karuka was a type of plow, and I know this is on one of the tests, folks, that I'm giving. I don't know if you'll see it on your test or not. But the Karuka is a type of plow that was developed. At first, oxen were used, but any of you know that oxen are slow. Then they used horses, and they would put teams of horses, maybe 20 horses to a team, and they were much faster. And what happened? The way they do it, the neighbors would all loan each other a horse. So I'll loan you your horse. I'll loan you my horse today, and we will plow your field, and then you loan me your horse tomorrow, and we'll all get together and we'll plow each other's fields. So farming became cooperative. Now this good times did not last. Plowing then was done in long trips. They'd make the horse go in a long, long straight strip. Then they'd turn around. It took a long time to turn around 20 horses. They'd turn around and the horse would plow for another long strip. So if you could have flown over your head, it would look like strips of bacon. And if any of you have ever flown over the Midwest, the United States, look down on that flat farmland, you'll see, of course it's more square than it was then, but you'll see what sometimes like strips of bacon. If you fly over Iowa, over Ohio, Illinois, and some of those flat places where they have a lot of farmland. Europeans could produce more food. They began to rotate their crops. We'll plant this crop this year, next year we'll plant another something else in the same field, and it would let land lie idle for 1 out of 3 years. Today we don't have to because we have fertilizers. Now this good times were to come to an end. Again, your book talks more, and I'll talk more about monasticism, the popes. All right. Some of the more powerful popes were Gregory VII. Gregory insisted the church should appoint its own officials. He was the one who clashed with Henry IV, the Holy Roman Emperor. Gregory VII eventually won over the issue. Eventually, now this looks like it should be pronounced Worms, but it's actually Worms in German. The Concordat of Worms was reached a compromise. It said the church must appoint the officials, but the lords could approve the choice. Today that's been changed. The church appoints the officials. The lords have no say-so in it. The most powerful of the European popes was Pope Innocent III. He believed that he was head. He said, "I am like the sun is, and the kings are like the moon. The kings only shine as a result of my brilliance. Kings receive their power from me, and I receive mine from God." Very, very, it sounds arrogant by today's standards. But he forced the more powerful kings of France to do his will. He told Philip Augustus, "I, the Pope, did not authorize this divorce, so you must take your wife back." And Philip did. John of England tried to do as his father Henry had done and appoint the Archbishop of Canterbury. The Pope said, "No, I appoint the Archbishop of Canterbury, you don't." King John acquiesced. He used the interdict. When a nation was under interdict, there could be no sacraments performed and no marriages performed. Supposedly, any man who died while a country was under the interdict, his soul was forever lost. The Inquisition. Now, folks, this is one of the most black parts of church history. The Inquisition was where that the church would torture people to make them conform. Quite painful. There were machines invented that would tear a person apart, joint to joint, tear one joint out of another. I mean, excruciatingly painful. Or a lot of persons who were considered heretics were burned for their beliefs. For many generations, no pope ever apologized, but Pope John Paul II did issue an apology for the Inquisition. So the church has somewhat dealt with the issue. He and his successors killed more dissenters than all the other popes combined. They defined sacraments, and he set up indulgencies. Now, I'm going to elaborate on that a little bit. I mean, I can never talk about indulgencies without blushing. In a minute, you might know why. An indulgency simply was where you purchased forgiveness for a sin. It basically meant if you wanted to commit a certain sin, you'd go to the priest, and you'd tell the priest what sin you wanted to commit. Then you and the priest would haggle over how much money you should pay. And once you and the priest agreed on a certain amount, a certain fee, then the priest would write you out a bill of indulgency, and then you would go out and at least try to commit the sin that you had just purchased forgiveness for. Now, if you think the theology is bad, everybody today thinks it too, and the Catholic Church has admitted the sale of indulgencies is wrong. I mean, the sale of indulgencies was to bump head on into a certain man one day. Anybody know who I'm talking about? The sale of indulgences got stopped. Who's the man I'm thinking about? Named Martin Luther. Yeah, Martin Luther spoke out hard against it because it got to where it got out of hand. But St. Peter's was built by money collected from the sale of indulgences. Wow. The settlement went on for several hundred years, but it got worse and worse with each generation until finally, when Martin Luther spoke out against it, he was able to get a following because a lot of Europeans were thinking, hey, this whole idea is wrong. And today, I mean, I've seen it in Catholic literature, even the Catholics will say they were wrong. But it took some doing to undo it. Now, some people believe that one of the reasons why Europe grew and eventually became like the top, became the top achiever of all the human ethnic groups, the Europeans were. One of the reasons is Europe was capable of reform. You don't find a period of time called the Reformation in the Islamic world. You don't find much of a Reformation in the Indian. When India finally reformed it because the British took over and kind of forced reform on them. But in Europe, among Europeans, I challenge you to find an abuse that was not followed by some call for reform. Every abuse that Europe had, they tended to reform. Now, another thing that might have helped make Europe great was they set up universities. The first university was in Bologna, Italy, and it was where students and scholars would get together. And then after a while, they set up one in France, and then one in Oxford, England. And all these universities, by the way, still exist. There's still a university of Bologna, and they'll tell you they were the first university established. The first one north of the Alps was in Paris. Eventually, every king in Europe was getting together his professors, calling them doctors. And Europeans began to collect all the knowledge they could into one place, named the university. And eventually, I mean, they were wrong on some things that they taught, but eventually European universities were able to guide Europe into a better culture, higher levels of learning, and then eventually into science and technology. At first, they didn't teach science. It was not considered a subject for university level. They would teach things like theory and logic, Latin, and theology. They ran into the inevitable conflict between faith on the one hand and reason on the other. Scholasticism was the attempt to deal with it. A lot of scholastics liked Aristotle, and they almost made Aristotle into a Christian, even though Aristotle lived some 300 years before Christ. But it was said they baptized Aristotle. With all respect, Aristotle did a lot though to lead him astray and tell him that it was wrong to own money with interest, and hey, without that, you don't have a banking system. Without a banking system, you can't have a complex economy. Some church officials did not approve of studying Aristotle. Now, along comes Thomas Aquinas. Most of you have probably never heard of him. He goes along with a class of men, along with Plato and Newton and Einstein, men who explained the universe with the theology or science or reasoning of their day, and got other men to listen to them. I mean, every one of us probably thinks we can explain the universe. But a few men, like Plato and Thomas Aquinas, explain the universe in such a way that other people will nod their head and say, yes, I agree. Now today we would not agree with what Thomas Aquinas, but Thomas Aquinas tried to reconcile all knowledge into one unified body. Well, some 500-600 years later, Albert Einstein was to try to do the same thing, called the TOE, or theory of everything. That we're going to someday be able to explain everything. Don't believe it, folk. In 1950, the year after I was born, some scientists said, we think we just about, well, there's a few things we haven't explained yet, but we just about have explained everything. Just on a verge, folk. So fast forward 60 years, and we go, hey, we don't have a really good theory that explains anything. Well, on a practical level, we've made better inventions, better cars, better computers. But what's the theory behind all these things? In short, simple language, folk, we don't know how any of it really works. Oh, we know we put this resistor here, put this capacitor here, and put this transistor there, and do it the right way, tweak it a little bit, it'll work. That's technology. But every theory we have, whether it be the theory of gravity, the theories about the speed of light have some compelling reason why they simply cannot be true. Today, some science way to admit there are some things that we just simply are not going to explain. Latin became replaced by the vernacular and even in church services. All right, now this thing about the cathedrals, Romanesque cathedrals were barrel roofs. They were sturdy, but they were dark inside. Then came the Gothic cathedral. The Gothic cathedral had a pointed arch that pointed skyward, suggesting heaven. It had ribbed vaults, and it was very light inside. Why these margins came about, simply folk, I don't know. I did not do it, it did itself. These margins here on the right, I don't know what happened there. Study that when you're studying for the final. Ranks, nobility. If you had lived in Europe during the Middle Ages, you'd have probably been someone's vassal. The Pope was vassal to God. The Emperor was vassal to the Pope. The King was vassal to the Pope. The princes were vassal to the King. Under some kings, they had viceroys. Then you had your nobility. The Emperor, King, and Prince and Viceroy, they were considered royalty. Nobility, the Duke, Archduke, Marquis, Count, Earl, Viscount, Baron, they were considered nobility. Some of this is self-explanatory. All right, now we're into chapter 13. While Europe was declining, the Byzantine Empire was thriving. The Byzantine Empire was what was left of the Roman Empire. It had its headquarters in Constantinople, and it lasted 1,000 years. Beginning with 300s when Constantine moved the capital of Constantinople, and ended when the Muslims took over it in 1453. They fought long wars with Persia. Constantinople was by far the largest city in Europe. Their strongest king was Justinian, and he actually restored much of the Roman Empire, but he got himself deep into debt, overextended himself, and within 3 years after he died, the empire fragmented. One of the problems was a plague hit the empire. This was a problem that they had in those days too. Population decline. All right, folks, I want to tell you why the plague and why the population declined. In short, simple language, the climate cooled down. It's harder to prove when you go back to the 400s, 500s, when Justinian lived around the year 500. But now when you get to the year 1300, 800 years later, it's easy to prove by studying tree rings, by studying journals, by studying the crops they could grow. But the population decline was brought about by global cooling. And during this time, the Muslims got control of Syria, Palestine. Then came the Bulgars from Central Asia, and they threatened the empire. Make a long story short, there were some dynasties that temporarily revived the empire, but eventually the empire continued to decline. The Eastern Orthodox Church broke away from the Roman Catholic Church. To save the empire, the Byzantine Emperor called for the Crusades. Now, Crusades. I must mention now, essentially, the Crusades were where, instead of Europe waiting for the enemies to come to them, they decided to get up and take the fight into enemy territory. And folk, there have been persons who have apologized for the Crusades, but someone else says we need to apologize for that apology. We don't owe these people any apology. Here's why. They were fighting against people who had vowed to destroy them and would have destroyed them if they could have. There were altogether about 200 movements called Crusades. Of those, 4 of them are more important than the others. Or some say there were 9 that are more important, but even of those 9, 4 are more important. The 4 that we want to learn, the first crusade was the only one that was a military success. Kings did not go along, French nobles led it, and it actually conquered the Holy Land. Muslims or Saracens began to take back their old territory. So kings of Europe got involved. Louis VI of France carried his wife Eleanor with him, and Eleanor hopped from one man to another. Well, I mean, there were 50 women she carried with her, and for those thousands of men, and these women went haywire. But it failed to gain any territory. It could not organize itself, was abandoned. Then came King Richard of England and Philip Augustus, but they were opposed by a Muslim leader who actually was able to unite the Islamic world for a while. The First Crusade caught the Islamic world off guard. They weren't ready for the arrival of Europeans, but by the time the Third Crusade came about, Saladin had the Muslim world organized. And folk, I want to tell you something. If the Muslim world can find a leader, now, I've said this before, Islam might have conquered the world, except for one thing. They keep fighting among themselves. And just yesterday, a bunch of ISIS executioners were lined up by some Syrian rebels, and they killed these ISIS executioners, more than 20 of them. I don't know if any of you noticed or not. But basically, it's Muslims fighting Muslims. If the Muslim world can ever find one man who can lead them, I don't dare say what they might. But in the case of Saladin, he was able to unite them, and they defeated the Third Crusade, including Richard the Lionhearted, Philip Augustus. Frederick also went along. Frederick drowned on his way. Philip Augustus abandoned it and left Richard to fight by himself. And the Fourth Crusade, instead of helping Constantinople, they turned on the Byzantine Empire. And the Byzantine Empire was never able to recover after that. Now, there was another crusade, folk, I think it's worth mentioning, called the Children's Crusade. Two large groups of children, ages like 13 to 12 to 19, decided that they could do what their elders had not been able to do, and they marched toward the Holy Land, but they never got as far as Constantinople. Every person who participated was either killed or carried into slavery. Now, if you're wondering how in the world did parents let their children go on such a thing, look, it's just one of those, it'll be up to psychology to try to explain it. One of those things you really can't quite explain or understand. It failed miserably. A lot of the children were sold into slavery or died along the way. All right, in the 1307, the Black Death hit Europe. Summers were shorter. There were heavy storms and constant rains. Crops were destroyed. Starvation resulted. Folk, you know what I'm about to say. It was caused by cruelty. Now, one of you turned in a paper, and I don't want to put it up because I don't know who it was, that mankind is on the verge of going through a sixth extinction. In other words, because of what mankind is doing, putting out all this carbon into the atmosphere, we're going to have a huge mass extinction. I want to remind you, there was a time when the Earth had a uniform tropical climate. I mean, the whole world was tropical, even Antarctica down under. Antarctica has a lot of tropical plants and animals. This period is called the Cretaceous period. See, if you want to look up, I just looked it up. Createous. And life on Earth during the Cretaceous period was never, ever better. And it was hot. Why are we so afraid of the Earth warming up? Oh yeah, the heat was caused by the continents splitting up and releasing a whole lot of carbon gases into the air. What I'm telling you, folks, is standard paleontology. The more carbon released in the air, the better the plant life is. The better the plant life, the better the animal life. If I'm wrong, tell me. The reason I'm telling you this is such a hot issue now. We're so concerned we're going to destroy the planet by the carbon gases, which therefore we must make these civilized people uncivilized and destroy all nations that have any kind of mass technology, mass production of mass automobiles, so that the primitive nations in the world can take charge and rule. Again, if I'm wrong, tell me. One of the things that the cooling of the climate brought about was the Black Death. The famine may have made people less resistant to infection, but it was the first plague that struck Europe. Folks, during the 700-year period while Europe was hot, there were no plagues. Then came the Black Death, and it carried away a third of Europe's population. Black rats moved in, and they were infested with fleas. Now, if any of you know anything about parasitology, I took a course in I have a minor, an undergraduate minor in biology. I took a course in parasitology. Parasites can be really particular. There's these parasites that caused the Black Death would only live on black rats. They could not live on brown rats. Yes?
You know what, you're right. Because we've been in Jamaica for so long.
Yeah.
I never know about salmonella until I came here. The things that I see here, since I came here, the contrast of the heat and the cold, especially heat and cold, I'm always sick. But back home, it's totally different. We don't have a drought. There's nothing.
Jamaica is one of the most blessed tropical paradises on the face of the earth. Always have the right amount of rainfall. The temperature goes from 80 to 86 year round, practically constant temperature. And a person who's not acclimated to this kind of climate will be sick a lot. I can understand because I've been to Jamaica 2 times.
No, we don't have no snow down there, so.
Yeah, very. But again, things as the climate cooled, plant life declined. Farmers would try to grow the same crops that they'd grown for years, and all of a sudden, the crops wouldn't grow. Either a frost would hit them too early, or they'd plant the same time they always did. I mean, I grow a small garden, and I can tell you there's a certain limit of time you can plant. You have to plant between April 15th, most plant between April 15th and May 18th, or thereabouts. Do that, and if you don't plant in that time period, the frost will hit you. Again, most of you might not know what I'm talking about, but some of you might. The Black Death started in Central Asia, and Genghis Khan is believed to have carried it with him across when, these rats followed Genghis Khan and his army as they went across. In 1347, Genoese merchants brought the disease to Sicily, and it again wiped out whole villages. Europe did not recover its population until the mid-1700s. Yes?
It wasn't just because I did a paper on this just because.
What's that?
I wrote a paper on this because why not? It sounded like fun. But one of the other factors was it wasn't just the Black Plague that destroyed it. It was also the fact that when there were some people that survived and some that didn't, people started going on killing crusades, accusing like the Jews and.
You're jumping ahead of me. Go ahead.
Oh well, no.
You're jumping ahead of me.
But basically, one of these like crazy killing crusades because the nobility no longer had income. There was no food, and so everybody was accusing everyone else, and they basically went mad and destroyed everything that they built up over the last like hundreds of years.
Now, one group of people who did not seem to suffer from the plague as much were old maids. Does anybody know what do old maids tend to have around their house? And they didn't even know. Cats. Excellent. Well, you might say, what did cats do for them? The cats kept away the rats. Cats can be a really good investment. I have 3 cats. The cats kept the rats away. Well, anyway, the old maid, people accused the old maids of being witches. How come they don't get the plague? And the other group of people who didn't get the plague were Jews. I don't know if Jews like cats so much, but the Jews, Moses commanded the Jews to be clean. And Jews had an emphasis on cleanliness. And it is known that if these people would have washed their food better and cooked more thoroughly, they could have stopped the plague pretty much in its tracks, as it was the Jews did. So they accused the Jews, like they did the old men, of practicing magic, and they would go to a Jewish community, set it on fire, and they would dance around praising God hilariously. I hate to say it, but I have to, because they would praise God hilariously while the Jews inside were screaming their last while they were being burned alive. This is standard history. Again, what you were saying, you jumped the gun. That's okay. Anyone who wants to comment. The plague did not end, but in the late 1600s, Europe started to recover its population. Then the climate cooled again. They had a little ice age. This you'll find out when you take second semester of world history. A little ice age brought about more plague. But then, around the year 1750, the smallpox vaccination was invented. Jenner looked at the microscope and said, hey, these creatures I see in the microscope can cause disease. So they learned how to wash their hands, wash their utensils, wash their cooking stuff. And then the climate cooled. And guess what? things have been getting better and better ever since. The climate warms and warms and warms and warms. Well, it's standard as much as I can make it standard. So if the climate is warming, I have to ask, what is the big deal? The big deal is they want to destroy America's technology and America's military superiority. If any of you think otherwise, I'll promise you I won't argue, I'll let you speak. While this was going on again, peasants revolted. The nobility seemed to be weakened, so the peasants rose up like we just talked about. Nobility and knights were killed, and it got to where the peasants actually marched on London. And King Richard II said, hey, if you disperse, I'll give you concessions. As the rebels went home, but Richard broke his promise and punished the rebels. However, there was some good came out. Wages went up. Some kings tried to keep wages down. But again, the reason the wages went up was workers were so scarce that the few workers there were, good workers, people, the nobles were willing to pay for. All right. Now, there came a big war called the 100 Years' War because it lasted 100 years. Essentially, it was when the last king of France died without an heir, and folk, I could go into a lot more detail, but basically the last king of France died without an heir. And the king of England said, I'm related to the French royal line, I should be king. The French people said, no, we're not going to have you as our king. So the king of England went to try to claim the throne of the king of France. There were other reasons, but the result was a war that was to last on and off for 100 years. At least twice there was 20 years of peace. Philip the Fair was the king, and he had 3 sons, and all 3 sons got the throne. The first one lasted 6 years, he died. The second one lasted 6 years, he died. Both of them got an heir. The third one was about to have a child, but that child was stillborn. But he died before the child. They waited to see if the child would be a boy or a girl, but the child was stillborn, so it didn't matter. And the throne of France was vacant. So Edward III said he should have the throne. And what followed was known as the 100 Years' War. Now, during this war, the foot soldier was to become more important. Gunpowder was to become more important. The pikeman and a bowman. In other words, the pikeman would have this thing called a pike. It actually was a long spear. But unlike the spears you throw, the pike was a heavy, heavy spear that the pikeman would keep a hold of. But they would line up shoulder to shoulder with their pikes extended, and they could even kill a knight in armor. Or even a knight in armor would not march against these pikes. The pikeman, because again, it took some organization, but the disciplined pikeman and the bowman. Bows became bigger. The longbow that was 6 foot long was invented, and the longbow was strong enough it could penetrate armor. The longbow also could shoot a lot farther. Then the crossbow. The crossbow, it would take, you have to use a lever to get the bow cocked. But once it shot with such force that it could penetrate the suit of armor. It could penetrate a knight, it was the knight's shield and the knight's armor both. And it did a lot to destroy the armored knight. Gunpowder also. Now, the knights would be putting on more and more armor, but the armor just simply weighed them down more. 2 big battles, the Battle of Crécy and the Battle of Agincourt. Here's what we remember about the Battle of Crécy. The French knights marched into battle. Actually, they galloped into battle on their horses, and they were met by arrows. Rain came up, and it made the area slippery. Well, the footmen, the bowmen, did not mind the mud so much, but the French knights on their horses slipped in the mud. And once they slipped in the mud, both horse and knight were suffocated. It took 6 men to get a knight back up once he fell, and the knight's squires remained back off the battlefield. Couldn't help the knight once he fell down. So mostly a knight, when he fell, he suffocated under his armor because his armor was too heavy for him to get back up. So the battle was an English victory, but it was not decisive. Well, make a long story short, I could spend a whole semester talking about the 100 Years' War. At the end of the war came a woman on a scene named Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc was concerned because the fighting, after a lull of 20 years of fighting, resumed again, and it looked like the English were winning. Well, Joanne was starting at 10 years old, began to pray, "Oh Lord, save France," and she began to hear voices. Now, folk, I'm not going to try to explain what the voices were. I'm just going to give this to you the way they told it. She heard voices, and the voices would tell her, "Go and lead an army and defeat the English." So Joanne went to her local lord, Sir Robert Beaumains. The only reason he's remembered was because of Joanne. And at first, Sir Robert laughed at her. I mean, you know, it was not unheard of for women in those days to go to a nobleman and discuss their problems with a nobleman. But when she went to the nobleman, it was not unheard of for women to volunteer to join the army either. It's known several of them did, and some of them served with distinction. When she went and requested that she go to the king and that he send her to the king with an escort, and that she could lead an army to defeat the English, he laughed at her at first. But then, folk, we don't know how she did it, but somehow she persuaded him to take her seriously. He sent an escort, and they would travel at night and then hide in the daytime, travel at night and hide to evade the English. The word got around that she was coming. When she got to the castle where King Charles VII was, one of the guards made fun of her, and she said, "You better watch what you're saying, for your death is near." Within an hour, that guard was dead. When she went to the room to see the king got a little bit wild. I mean, this king was an intelligent man. Whatever he couldn't make firm decisions, but he still was an intelligent man. He said to one of his lackeys, he said, "Hey, you're my size. Let's go to the next room." So the king and lackey went to an adjacent room and they changed clothes. The lackey came out with the royal robes and a crown on his head, and the lackey sat on the throne. The king came out with the lackey's tray, and stood the lackey's tray, looked like a lackey, and everybody, of course, said, "Ha ha, we're going to make a dunce out of this young girl." So when Joanne in the room, having supposedly never seen the king before, she ignored the lackey who was sitting on the throne. Now, folk, this part of the story was told by the most educated, best minds of Europe. I mean, it's original. This is the way they told it. Don't ask me to explain. She ignored the lackey who was sitting on the throne, and she went to the man in lackey clothes who was holding a tray and bowed down and did homage. "What are you doing homage to me for?" And he was genuinely surprised. He said, "You're the Dauphin." She wouldn't call him king because he hadn't been crowned yet. Dauphin was a title that the French used for their heir apparent. He said, "You're the Dauphin." The court could do nothing but applaud. She had made it. Well, King Charles, being an indecisive man, had to make a decision. His city of Orleans was being besieged, and for a while he could do nothing about it. Then all of a sudden, volunteers were pouring into his army from all over the realm, and even outside the realm. And all of a sudden he had this army that he didn't have before, and he knew the reason he had the army because of Joanne. That they volunteered, but Joanne inspired the French people with what they needed. They needed a sense of patriotism. They needed somebody to fire them up and make them willing to fight, and she did that. Now the king had to decide, do I give this army to this peasant girl or do I not? Her only qualification was that she was the main reason he had the army in the first place. He tried to farm out the decision to this bishop, to that priest, and they would examine, is Joanne of Arc a virgin? They finally decided that she was. Is she a witch? They couldn't resolve that. Well, to make a long story short, the king couldn't do any better, so he finally gave her command of the army. She went, and to make a long story short, she won the Battle of Orleans. She won 4 battles. Then she was captured by the Burgundians, the people who should have been loyal to the French anyway, and she was turned over to the English. The French king showed no interest in helping her. The English tried her for witchcraft, burned her at the stake, but no sooner had they done so than some of them realized, hey, God help us, we burned a saint. Eventually, her mother was given a title of nobility. Her father died 2 years later of a broken heart. But 20 years later, her mother requested that the king write a letter to the Pope to retry Joanne's case, basically appeal to a higher authority. The popes usually up in years, only lasted a few years in those days anyway. The first pope who heard the case acquitted Joanne of all the charges that were laid against her by bishops who were now dead. There were still some charges that remained. Well, that pope died, and when he died, all the bishops who had condemned Joanne were dead also. So the king wrote a letter to the next pope. The next pope cleared Joanne of all charges, and Joanne's mother lived to see Joanne completely cleared of all charges of witchcraft and restored to the church. In 1920, when the Catholic Church needed to unite Europe, they needed a hero. They made Joanne the hero. It was after World War I. World War I had really scarred up Europe. She was declared a saint. May 30th is her day. You don't hear much talked about her anymore, but on May 30th, if you look it up, there'll be some reference made to St. Joan of Arc. The war was to drag on a few more years, but it ended in a French victory. Again, I could talk more about it. You had numerous peasants' revolts that occurred and tore, again, as we've already mentioned, tore up everything. Nobles wanted to weaken monarchy. For a time, most kings had their power weakened, then later kings reasserted themselves. The Byzantine Empire was destroyed in 1453 by the Muslims when they found a weakened empire. One of the things, folks, that had helped the Byzantine Empire was they had an invention called Greek fire. We don't know what Greek fire is, but it was said that when Greek fire touched a wooden ship, that wooden ship was... The fire, it was said, would burn even after the ship went underwater. Some people believe it was a combination of tar and sulfur and maybe magnesium. If any of you know anything about magnesium, magnesium can burn with an extremely bright flame. At Lockheed, we worked with magnesium. We had to be really careful how we worked with it because it could ignite. But again, we don't know for sure what Greek fire considers a secret, and the secret supposedly has been lost. Anyway, the Byzantine Empire had been reduced to where it had little more than Constantinople. The year 1453 has been called a turning point. Two things happened. Number one, the 100 Years' War ended with a French victory. Number two, the Byzantine Empire fell with a victory for the Muslims. The Muslims were to use the Byzantine Empire as a springboard to try to conquer the rest of Europe. And as recently as 1680, that may not sound recent to you, but in 1680 they went as far as Vienna. They were stopped. And then technology just went all to the European side and disfavored the Muslim side. And Islam fell way behind technologically and have remained so to this day. The church, which had been so powerful, finally had someone stand up to them. Pope Boniface VIII tried to oppose King Philip the Fair, Philip IV, otherwise known as Philip the Beau or Philip the Handsome, Philip the Fair. Philip went into Italy to try to capture the Pope and make a slave of him. The Pope fled, but he died of a broken heart shortly afterward. Philip then moved the capital of the papacy to a French city of Avignon, and for 70 years, the popes ruled from Avignon. It's called the Babylonian captivity. If you know anything about the Bible, the Jewish Babylonian captivity lasted 70 years. During that time, the Avignon popes and most of the cardinals were French. But after 70 years, they elected a new pope who moved back to Rome. But another party said, no, the popes have been in Avignon for 70 years. We're going to keep them there. So another party elected a pope who stayed in Avignon, so the church now had two popes. Well, they met at a council and said, no, we've got to resolve this. So they elected a third pope. But the other two would not retire, so now the church had three popes. All this was to damage and weaken the power of the papacy and pave the way for the Protestant Reformation that was to come a little bit more than 100 years later. Well, the schism damaged the church and damaged papal authority. What they finally did, the kings and nobles of Europe got together and said to the church, get a council, form a council, choose a pope, and whoever you choose will accept him. So the council met and they chose a pope, and the other popes were forced to retire because none of the nobility of the kings and princes of Europe had all promised to support him. Now, I want to make this very clear. You may notice that the church chose a pope. You might say, why is that important? It's very important because in Russia, the czars chose the patriarchs. And what happened? Russia fell to communist. In Europe, church and state are separate. Now, the story of the fight between church and state is a dirty story, a crooked story. When the smoke had cleared, The church was a church independent of the state. The state was a state independent of the church, and I have to say amen. And then when the Protestant Reformation came, the Protestant nations were independent of the state also. And the Protestant countries were also independent of the church. Church and state remained independent of each other. And this has generally worked. Now, I even read a book by an atheist one time who was really upset when Hitler took over the church because somehow he just felt like, even as an atheist, hey, this is wrong. The church and state have been independent for hundreds of years. Now here's Adolf Hitler. Well, it was wrong. Church and state, again, some people believe that this is another reason why Europe was to eventually burst out of its seams and hit and overtake much of the world, completely overrun the Americas, overrun much of the Far East, overrun much of Africa. Whether they should have or not, they did, and have a scientific explosion, invent the train, the automobile, the television. Again, because Europe separated church from state and made religion a matter of where it's voluntary. Hopefully no one is coerced to join, at least not when they're adult. Kids may be told they have to go to church, but when you turn a certain age, you decide whether you want to or whether you don't. Again, and each person makes his own decision based on the conscience. Do I drink or do I not drink? Do I smoke or do I not smoke? Do I join a church or do I not? Again, it's better that these decisions be left up to each individual rather than Big Brother telling you what you have to do, as it is in some countries. Okay, we'll leave that